He was one of the greatest enemies the Romans ever faced. An excellent general, a larger-than-life figure, who led an army across the Alps and dealt a series of crushing defeats upon the Romans on Italian soil. His achievements have become a thing of legend.
He was this man who did the unpredictable, who could find a way out, who could solve these seemingly insoluble problems.
His name immortalised. Hannibal.
The Romans, of course, become so powerful, and the Romans conquer the whole of the Mediterranean world. And Hannibal was the one who challenged the Romans the most.
Hannibal Barca rests among antiquity's greatest generals. But how did he rise to become such an accomplished commander, leading his men to incredible victories against the then dominant power in the Western Mediterranean? How did he rise to become the bane of Rome?
He takes his army from Spain and says, okay, Italy's your heartland, Rome's your capital, that's where I'm going.
Why is it that he marches across these mountain ranges rather than sailing?
It's the thing that everybody remembers the most about him, is that he crossed the Alps with elephants.
You know, it is very hard to resist the lure of this epic.
This is the rise of Hannibal.
This government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
Whether Russia has been provoked. What matters is that Russia has been wrong in its response.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation. Terror beseitigt, bewahren wir das Land Christi.
Exclusive documentaries and ad-free podcasts with top historians. Watch on your smart TV or mobile device by downloading the History Hit app.
Hannibal was born in 247 BC, at a time when turmoil had seized the Western Mediterranean.
Hannibal was born into a world war, essentially. The Western Mediterranean was aflame. The Romans and the Carthaginians were in the middle of a very long war, the First Punic War, which started in 264 BC. Hannibal is born towards the end of that war, and his father is the prominent commander in the Carthaginian overseas theatre fighting against the Romans. So Hannibal was born into a world where the Romans and the Carthaginians have been going at it for more than a decade and a half, and they still have quite a bit of time to run as well.
The Romans ultimately won the First Punic War, kicking the Carthaginians out of Sicily and securing the island for themselves. The defeat proved devastating to Carthage and what remained of its much reduced empire. An empire in which Hannibal's family played a prominent role.
We know a lot less about Hannibal's family, the Barcid dynasty, than we'd like. Now, really, it emerges with Hannibal's father, Hamilcar. He's important. He's a leading general in the First Punic War and goes on to be a leading commander subsequently. That suggests the family is one of these aristocratic, wealthy houses within the Carthaginian Republic that has a dominant role in politics, in public life. Whether it's particularly military or not, who knows?
There are some really interesting theories about Hannibal's family, but we don't necessarily have any proof. So we know that he is either from a very, very old family that came with the original colonists from Tyre, or we think that perhaps the name Barcid is actually connected to a place that's in Libya today that was part of the area of Cyrenaica, and that the name that the Barcid family comes from that, it's a geographical toponym, and that it is connected to Hannibal's family as mercenary soldiers 3 generations before, in the end of the 4th century BC, and that they are Encompassed into the Carthaginian world, also the fact that they might be part of a sort of military hierarchy. So your father's a general, your great-grandfather's a general, and you inherit that position.
Hannibal spent his early years in North Africa, right at the heart of the Carthaginian Empire.
So Hannibal's got older sisters. He's actually the oldest brother. So as he begins to grow up, he has two other brothers who come into the world. He was brought up, he probably had a relatively typical Carthaginian elite upbringing. So he would have been educated in various languages, obviously Punic, but probably Greek as well, which was the sort of lingua franca of the Mediterranean. It's possible that he was raised in Carthage, but his family also had estates at Hadrimentum to the south of the city, at a considerable distance. And so it's possible that Hannibal spent at least some time, not in the city, but on the estates where he probably experienced country life as well.
One figure who Hannibal did not have much contact with during his early years was his father, Hamilcar, the hero of Carthage.
We do know that the early years of his life, although Hamilcar would have been a famous name, he wouldn't have been a physical presence until Hannibal was almost into his teens. He's growing up in one of these families. They're very important within Carthage. This is Carthage fighting during the First Punic War and its immediate aftermath, when many of the Carthaginian troops, the mercenaries, the professionals they've hired, don't get paid properly, don't get treated well, so rebel, and Hamilcar makes his name defeating his former soldiers. Those are his greatest triumphs, rather bizarrely. So Hannibal is there seeing all this. People are telling him about it.
It would only be as Hannibal approached his 10th birthday that this distant father dynamic started to change.
There is this very famous story of the 9-year-old Hannibal being taken into a temple at Carthage, and his father, Hannibal Barca, asks him, "Would you like to come with me on campaign to Spain?" Obviously, boy who's barely seen his father, flattered by the attention. Wow, battles, excitement, armies, yeah, please. And then the father makes him take this oath.
So the oath is the first thing we know about Hannibal, and it's also one of the few things we know that may actually have come from the mouth of Hannibal himself. He may actually have told this story, and that's what makes it so interesting, because he tells the story when he's much older and he's living in exile in Ephesus, and he is working for the Hellenistic king Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. And Hannibal tells him this story. He says, look, Antiochus, when I was 9 years old, my father made me swear an oath that I would never be a friend of the Romans. So it gives us this idea, just before this big departure to Spain, Hamilcar is sacrificing to the gods, and he brings his young 9-year-old son up to the altar and where the sacrificial remains are. And he makes Hannibal put his hand on the altar and swear this oath, never ever to become a friend of the Romans.
Hannibal headed to Spain with his fathers and his brothers, where he received a military education.
Hamilcar was very concerned with educating his boys for war. This is part of the mythos of the Barcid animosity to the Romans, that what they really want to do is to get revenge on the Romans. And of course, Hamilcar thinks that his sons may be the tools for that. The education that Hannibal would have been both theoretical and practical. Theoretical in the sense that he learned military tactics, probably from books. He also studied directly with his father. He accompanied him on campaign in various places.
So he's trained as a soldier, as a commander, but he's also given training in philosophy, in all the things that a good Greek education would have been given. And he's trained in Greek because that was the way young elite men of the Mediterranean were, the language and the culture they were trained in.
And we know that in 229, when Hamilcar is finally killed by a Spanish tribe, that his sons were with him on that campaign.
And Hamilcar has died very heroically in the rear guard, covering the retreat of the column when they've been got into a sticky situation in northern Spain, and Hannibal and his brothers are some of those who escape. So the father dies, in the best possible heroic fashion.
Hannibal remained in Spain following his father's death, initially seeing service under his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal.
Hasdrubal was married to one of their older sisters, and he takes over as the Carthaginian commander in Spain, and Hannibal is a young, dynamic commander.
He's labeled hypostrategos, which is a term which basically means kind of sub-general, and probably right-hand man of Hasdrubal in Spain. So he's sent on most of the dangerous missions. He learns the craft of command and strategy in the field by leading the cavalry, by leading various contingents on various campaigns.
But in 221 BC, Hasdrubal was assassinated. In his place, the officers of the Carthaginian army elected the 26-year-old Hannibal. Hannibal now had command of a mighty Carthaginian force.
The army that Hasdrubal and Hamilcar had crafted, that Hannibal inherits, is one that is formed really of two major elements. First, there's an African contingent, which was the core that was brought over in the initial conquests. And then in Spain, proper, Hannibal draws on a whole range of warrior groups that lived and inhabited Spain itself. So various Spanish tribes handed over troops to Hannibal, and he recruited heavily amongst these Iberians.
Hamilcar has been campaigning in Spain for quite a long time. And then there are more campaigns under Hasdrubal and then more under Hannibal. So you have within this army a hardcore of soldiers that have served with the family or under the family for quite a long time. They are not serving like Roman legionaries under obligation as part of their citizenship. So they're professionals.
But he also has elephants. For his campaign, 37 elephants, which he will take and march to Italy with.
Backed by this formidable force, Hannibal continued to campaign in Spain, following in the footsteps of both his father and brother-in-law. His attention soon turned to the city of Saguntum.
Saguntum achieves importance at the start of the Second Punic War, in part by accident. It's modern-day Sagunto. It's beyond the area that Carthage already dominates, but it has allies amongst the tribes that are nearer to Carthage, and the Carthaginians have allies amongst the tribes facing it. And the dispute arises because some of Hannibal's allies complain about the Saguntines fighting on behalf and supporting some of their rivals.
This local dispute was the source of tension between Hannibal and the Saguntines. But what made this seemingly small squabble so potentially volatile was who the Saguntines were allied to.
Hannibal backs his allies against the Saguntines. The Saguntines, at some point, have formed an alliance with Rome. It is not at all clear when.
And if you can think about the way that Hannibal is rampaging all over the Iberian Peninsula, especially he's done a great deal since Hasdrubal. So he's conquered way up into the Celtiberian regions. Some think maybe as far as Salamanca. And some of the towns in the area are getting a little bit nervous, obviously, about this Carthaginian expansion. They're like, yeah, okay, so who are you going to call? When you have the Carthaginians on one side, well, you're going to call to the Romans, really. They're the other big power in the state.
The Saguntines appeal to Rome when Hannibal turns up to threaten them. The Romans send an embassy, they don't send an army, partly because they're busy elsewhere and they don't have troops and resources, and also, it's a long way away. Hannibal receives the Roman embassy, says, look, I'm not interested, and sends them on to Carthage. They don't get any more from that. And he attacks Saguntum. Takes about 8 months, so it's a prolonged siege. Eventually breaks in, sacks the town, enslaves the survivors.
Saguntum had fallen. With the city now firmly in Carthaginian hands, Hannibal had crossed his Rubicon. Carthage was set for another massive conflict with Rome.
The Romans take this very much as a slight, because again, they've demanded something and someone else who is a former enemy is not behaving as a former defeated enemy ought to. So they send another embassy to Carthage, and this is the famous one where the ambassador says, I've got peace or war inside my toga, which one do you want? And the Carthaginians are supposed to tell him, we want war.
It's not clear whether Hannibal improvises a plan when the war breaks out, or whether there had been a long strategy developed by his family to always take this kind of approach that he adopts. What he does know is that the Romans prefer to fight abroad. The likely strategy will be that the Romans will launch an invasion of Africa and an invasion of Spain to take him on, but also to try and apply pressure and to bring the Carthaginians to their knees directly.
But Hannibal would not wait for the expected Roman attacks on Spain and Africa. He would take the fight to them.
And so his plan is essentially to march to Italy and fight the war in Italy, which the Carthaginians never really managed in the First Punic War, where they fought mostly in Sicily and sometimes in Africa. So this is a new, bold move.
He is going to fight the Romans in their heartland. He's going to do what the Romans would do. He's going to bludgeon them over the head repeatedly where they think they're safe, where they think they're strong, and make them come to the negotiating table, make them give in, because that's how wars end.
Fortunately for Hannibal, he had a precedent: the actions of another leader who had recently fought the armies of Rome on Italian soil.
So Pyrrhus was the king of Epirus, and he was the first of the sort of Hellenistic generals to come to the Western Mediterranean and to bring a Hellenistic army to the Western Mediterranean, to the central Mediterranean zone. And he invades Italy. He invades Italy because the Romans are encroaching on the Greek cities of the southern part of Italy, of the Arch of the Foot. And it's the people of Tarentum who ask Pyrrhus to come over and help out against the Romans. And Pyrrhus comes over with a big Hellenistic army. He brings elephants, the whole deal.
And when he came to southern Italy, he demonstrated several things about the Romans. A, they could be beaten in battle by a proper Hellenistic army with elephants. And secondly, that having won battles, it is likely that recently subdued and resentful allies will join. Hannibal is inspired by the fact that Pyrrhus detaches quite a number of Samnite tribes and other tribes in the south from the Roman alliance, and that sustains Pyrrhus's campaign and indeed Pyrrhus's allies when Pyrrhus moves to Sicily.
So Pyrrhus is really important because he's the first contact in a kind of military way with Rome and with Carthage, but also he's very important because he studied how to fight the Romans. And he seems to have written this down, and Hannibal seems to have studied his works or what Pyrrhus said. So we're told, of course, via our sources, that Pyrrhus's advice to anyone who wanted to fight the Romans was that you had to fight them in Italy. You couldn't fight them anywhere else, and you had to take their allies away from them.
Following in the footsteps of Pyrrhus, Hannibal planned to fight the Romans on Italian soil. The next issue was getting there.
Hannibal's route to Italy is not easy. It involves crossing two major mountain ranges, the Pyrenees and the Alps. Why is it that he marches across these mountain ranges rather than sailing there? And the simple answer is that the Carthaginian navy, after the First Punic War, is not the navy that it had been.
The balance of power has changed significantly after the First Punic War that restricts the options Hannibal has open to him. Up until the First Punic War, the Carthaginians had maintained a presence in Sicily for centuries. Carthage has lost the ports that give it the reach to get to Italy. So the naval option of forming a big army in modern-day Tunisia and crossing that apparently short distance, the direct route, to the toe of Italy, just isn't practical.
The other thing is he's got elephants and he's got many, many horses. His proportion of cavalry to infantry is much higher than most armies, and horses are just difficult to transport on ships.
The other thing, of course, is that Hannibal's power is based around Spain, and that's where his army's been formed, that's where he can draw resources, that's where he clearly has a lot more freedom than you suspect he would have in his homeland.
So it's much more sensible for Hannibal to march from Spain to Italy, even though the journey will be difficult.
So Hannibal is almost thinking and acting like a Roman when he takes his army from Spain and says, okay, Italy's your heartland, Rome's your capital, that's where I'm going. I can't get there by sea, so I'm going to walk there.
By the late spring of 218 BC, Hannibal's army was ready. To control Spain in his absence, he left his brother Hasdrubal with a sizable army. But with just over 100,000 troops, Hannibal started heading north. In record time, he covered over 300 miles and crossed the river Ebro. But it was then that his army came up against its first major test.
So Hannibal leaves New Carthage with an army of 90,000, we're told, 10,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. We know that he marches to the edge of Carthaginian territory, which is the Ebro River, and he crosses the river and he gets into this zone that's between the Ebro and the Pyrenees. Now this is unconquered territories. There's Greek colonial foundations on the coast, there's Celt-Iberian towns inland, and we aren't given a great deal of detail in the sources, but we are told there's fairly fierce fighting here.
And so Hannibal has to make sure that, firstly, he's able to cross this securely, but secondly, also, he's not going to leave anything in his rear that could be a problem. And obviously, he's expecting a Roman army to turn up in Spain, so he doesn't want to allow the Romans a base either for operations. So he spends some time subduing 4 big tribes to the north, and also he experiences some early desertions. So when some of the Spanish tribesmen realize that he's not just campaigning in Spain, but he's actually going to cross the Pyrenees and then some other mountains somewhere off in the far distance and then go to Italy, wherever the heck that is, they get a little bit discouraged and start to desert. So Hannibal lets them go. So he says, you go and I'll call on you at some later point. So he converts these potential disaffected groups into potentially willing recruits in the future, but he won't take them with him.
Hannibal's next obstacle was the Pyrenees.
We don't know very much. We know that he did it in 3 columns. We're not sure why. We don't know very much about the actual Pyrenees themselves. And we know that he went inland to do it. So he would have had to deal with some fairly significant mountain terrain there. Maybe he did it as training, if you think about it that way, because, I mean, realistically, he would have been well aware of what he was facing with this idea of crossing the Alps. But he had to move inland because of Roman allied cities on the coast.
Having crossed the Pyrenees, Hannibal's journey through southern Gaul proved relatively easy-going, having already established friendly relations with many of the region's local tribes. That was, however, until he reached the river Rhone.
So I always think the crossing of the Rhone is one of the most spectacular things Hannibal did. If you see the Rhone River today, it's a hugely managed river. It's much narrower than it was in antiquity. So it's a massive river to cross with an army of, say, now we're at 50,000 all in maybe, and elephants as well. And so he gets to the Rhone. Now he's north of the coast because of the Roman allied city of Marseille on the coast he needs to avoid. And I'm not sure if he was aware of how big a river the Rhone was or not, but he takes some time when he gets there and he buys up every bit of craft on the river, boats and dugout canoes, anything he can find to move his army across.
Crossing the Rhone would be a huge logistical challenge for Hannibal. A challenge made more difficult by what his army saw lying in wait for them on the opposite bank.
Now, the Gauls are groups of independent tribes. They have nothing whatsoever to do with the struggle between Carthage and Rome. They are simply in the way. But as with most ancient peoples, when this dirty great army turns up on your doorstep, you're faced with a choice. What do you do? And this is what happens. The local tribes gather on the far bank of the River Rhone. And it's a broad river, it's a big obstacle, it's going to be quite hard getting things like the elephants across anyway. You don't particularly want to do this as an opposed crossing because, again, Hannibal has to think, well, I need to get to Italy. I'd like to have as many of my best men still with me as I possibly can because the real war is going to start then. This is just a prelude, this is a sideshow.
Sideshow or not, Hannibal had to eliminate this Gallic threat. And the young Carthaginian commander quickly devised a plan.
And so he sends one of his commanders north up the river, and they cross over secretly and then come back along, and they sneak up on the enemy troops across the way.
They then, which is quite unusual, they spend more than a day. They rest up, and then only then do they move around to get to be in position behind the Gallic army. And the Gauls haven't noticed because they're not a professional army, and they don't. There is also a tendency, if you're the local people, you tend to think of a mountain range or a river. It's a big obstacle, that's going to stop anybody, isn't it? No one but a fool is going to attack across that. And people don't, as a rule, attack directly across rivers until Hannibal does.
And so Hannibal's kind of prepared to cross the river. He crosses. We're told that he crosses at the very front of all the boats and with lots of noise. And you have the other side of the river, you have the Celtic tribes yelling and everybody's going for it. And then there's an ambush from behind, and his surprise attack completely throws the enemy troops into confusion, and they take the east bank of the Rhone, and then it's all done.
The Gauls collapse because it's not what they expected, it's not what they wanted. You know, their attitude throughout has been quite reasonable. These people want to walk through our lands, our farms. What are they going to do? What are they going to steal? What damage are they going to do? Are they going to take over? Are they going to stay? It's perfectly reasonable for them to defend their homelands, but they're not really prepared for warfare in this big league. And they are simply outwitted, but it's a mark of Hannibal doing what his opponents don't expect, but doing it with great skill. So it's a foretaste, really, and it shows just how practiced this army already is before it gets anywhere near a Roman.
The battle was a stunning success for Hannibal. Quickly, he proceeded to ferry the rest of his army across the Rhone, including the elephants.
I don't think actually we should underestimate how well the Carthaginians understood their elephants, how they used their elephants, and also, of course, the fact that it was autumn by this point, the river is at its lowest point, and elephants can swim. So although our ancient sources construct some amazing stories about pontoons being built out onto the river and then covered in dirt so the elephants don't know they're getting onto a raft, and then being detached and chaos breaking out and everybody falling into the river, it could be that they did it that way, but the Carthaginians must have known that the elephants can swim, so they may have also done it that way as well.
Having crossed the River Rhone, Hannibal now set his sights on his next great geographic challenge, the Alps.
There was probably no way Hannibal was ever going to go into Italy rather than over the Alps. But there is certainly an easier way into Italy than he took. And in order to take the easier way into Italy, he would have had to follow the Durance River. And that in history was known traditionally as the way of Heracles or Hercules. And it was this sort of mythical road through the Alps that supposedly in myth Hercules took. So Hannibal probably was intending to go that way.
But if following in the footsteps of Hercules had been Hannibal's original plan, it was quickly thrown into disarray.
In the interim, Hannibal's Numidian scouts, about 500 of them, have been sent south to see what's going on and have encountered Romans. Roman cavalry under Scipio, Publius Scipio the Elder, have been progressing from Italy to Spain and have stopped at Marseille. And so the army of Scipio, a consular army, 2 legions, plus allies, considerable military force, has got to Marseille. They've heard that Hannibal's in the vicinity from their local Greek allies, and so they've reconnoitred up the river. The 2 forces clash, and the Numidians come off the worst, and the Romans pursue them more or less to their camp. So Hannibal realizes that there's a Roman army right there.
Now, Hannibal obviously, in one sense, was given an opportunity once the Romans arrive. Hey, look, there's an army, I can defeat it here. He's probably got a big numerical advantage, but it's a battle fought in southern Gaul. That's not going to impress the Romans if they're defeated as much as one in Italy. If he delays and spends weeks maneuvering, maybe longer, before he can secure that victory, the year is coming towards an end. The weather for going across the Alps is going to be that much worse.
Hannibal's response to this new Roman threat was striking and decisive.
Hannibal has no interest in doing battle in Gaul. He has learned from his experiences, and he also knows from what Pyrrhus told everybody, you need to fight the Romans in Italy in order to defeat them. And so he doesn't want to waste his energy fighting the Romans in terrain he doesn't know, in Gaul, when he needs to get to Italy to really start to work out his strategy. And his strategy is very, very clear, that he wants to detach the Romans from their allies and defeat them in Italy. So although he doesn't get to take the way that he would have liked to, which is the easiest crossing of the Alps, he has to go north then, and he has to go into the more difficult and more treacherous terrain of the crossing of the Alps.
So again, he does the unexpected. No sane person is going to think, oh yeah, we've bumped into these people, they're our enemy. They're actually going to march away from us and take what seems to be the hardest route possible away. So it does mean the Romans really don't have a clue what's happening. Things start quite well for Hannibal as he comes toward the Alps. And again, you see one of these very familiar situations in the ancient world, and you can look at it when you're looking at expansion by the Macedonians or the Romans later on. There's a tribe where two brothers are fighting for power. So one of them sees Hannibal and this great army coming along and says, whoopee, right, I'm going to be your friend, I'll do nice things for me, can you get rid of my brother for me? Which Hannibal promptly does, intervenes, puts this man in power, who then responds by giving him winter clothing, supplies, things that are very useful, and information. We forget how comparatively recent a well-mapped world is. So finding your way, you know broadly the route, and knowing that the route, well, that's the route the traders take, might not necessarily be the best route for an army to take. So getting information from locals is always very useful.
Which route that was, however, remains a subject of scholarly debate.
The routes that Hannibal might have taken across the Alps, I mean, that's been debated since antiquity, since Livy, who said, oh, they must have used this pass, or they must have used that pass, and he comes up with his own solution. The truth is, we don't really know which pass Hannibal used.
I would say, generally speaking, the experts have distilled it down into two different passes. One is the Col de la Traversette, and one is the Col de Clapier. Those are the two main contenders. We don't know which he took for certain, but there is certainly some interesting evidence in the ground that he took the Col de la Traversette. And that is excavations that have been done by a professor of geology, actually, who's fascinated by Hannibal. And he got some very interesting evidence that certainly is dated to the right times, and certainly a layer of the excavation that was evidence of a lot of people passing through, could very well be an army. And he found horse dung and DNA. And so there's some good evidence from this that there was an army going through there at around the same time. So it's tempting to say that we have conclusive evidence, but that's not yet available. We'd have to do a little bit more work, I think, on some of the other passes. But both passes are over 2,000 meters, and both passes would be a significant challenge for an army that he's carrying with him, and for the elephants and the pack animals and everything. It would have been quite extraordinary.
And so, in late 218 BC, Hannibal and his army commenced one of the most famous ventures in human history.
And Hannibal will begin the ascent of the Alps, and he's still got, an army of best part of 50,000 at this point, between 40 and 50,000. It's a big, big force. However, again, you're coming to the same situation. The locals, people live there, and suddenly this Carthaginian army has turned up and wants to march through their lands. And you have groups like the Allobroges, the tribes there, who traditionally, to pass through the passes of their land, you either pay them some money or expect to be robbed. And they want the same from the army, but this is not something Hannibal is willing to do, or probably able to do. And so he's soon attacked, and Hannibal again does the same sort of thing he's done before. He tries to use fast-moving columns moving at night, getting behind the enemy. The locals tend to think they're the only ones who know the routes, and that if they block this path, they're safe. And then they discover that actually, no, you can get around. And it's a shock. They often underestimate. Hannibal makes some mistakes. There are some quite serious losses, and there are problems that In some positions in the Alps, you can get above the enemy, but you're too far away actually to harm them. So at one point he gets to the crest, but then has to charge down to drive off men that have ignored him and are ambushing the main column. And an army this size, with the baggage, with the elephants that are, 37 of these things that are cumbersome, need lots of food, aren't really designed for this sort of thing, and that you're bringing because you think this is a real prestige weapon that will give you a great advantage. So you want to cosset them. But they're awkward, they're difficult. So there are lots of places in an army straggling along through valleys and over passes that it's vulnerable. So they have hard fighting for most of the ascent of the Alps.
So the main problem has been these tribes. After that, the tribes kind of give up. He's getting very high up into the pass now. And the second problem is, of course, is weather, that the weather is getting colder and colder, the snow is starting to form. And because of these difficulties, it's getting harder to keep the pack animals together. The recent attacks, which involved rolling boulders down on the Carthaginian army, had scattered some of the horses, scattered some of the pack animals as well, and caused all kinds of casualties amongst his men. So he's lost a lot of troops through this constant attrition that the Gallic tribes have placed on him. And the passes are becoming more precipitous, and it's difficult to keep your footing, and some people are falling off to their deaths.
Despite the difficulties Hannibal and his army face from hostile tribes, the elements and the terrain itself, 9 days after starting the crossing, they reached the summit of the pass. Ahead of Hannibal lay the Lombard Plain and the Po River Valley. His army could see the fertile lands of northern Italy, but reaching it would be far from easy.
If going up was hard, coming down is actually harder, because by the time he gets to the summit, the weather has changed for the worse. The snow has fallen, and not only is it snow, but it's snow on snow. It's on last year's snow. So there's fresh snow, which the pack animals kind of put their legs into, and then they break into the ice that's beneath. The other soldiers, so many thousands of other soldiers and horses, and indeed the elephants, who are marching through the fresh snow, are also churning up the snow underneath, and this is becoming very slushy and very slippery, and people start slipping off left and right and centre, and indeed even on your hands and knees it's even worse, apparently, according to the sources. You slide even faster. So this is incredibly difficult for Hannibal.
There is also a common thread in ancient literature about warfare and conquest, where it's about the great conquerors like Caesar, like Alexander. They conquer nature as well as the enemy. And Hannibal is very much within this idea that nothing can stop him.
And also, as he begins his descent, part of the pass has been washed away or knocked away by a rockfall. There's a story, in fact, that the army had to heat up the rockfall in front of them, the large boulders that were in the way, and then pour vinegar onto the heated rocks in order to crack them. This is a tall story, but actually, when you think about ancient armies, they often marched with old wine, with vinegary wine, because it was good for the coats of the horses. It kept hunger mange, which is a kind of animal scurvy, at bay. And so also vinegar can be drunk by men as well to kind of lessen thirst. So it's possible this is something that he did in order to break through.
3 days after clearing the landslide, Hannibal and his army emerged onto the plains of northern Italy. It had taken 15 days to cross the Alps, the climax to an epic venture that has become immortalised.
There is such a drama about Hannibal's march to Italy, most of all in the Alps, but even, crossing the Rhone and getting elephants onto barges and all of these things. It is a terrific story. And when you write about it, or when people make documentaries or dramas about it, you are drawn. It is very hard to resist the lure of this epic, because it does seem to be up there with Troy and all these, it's just a great, great story.
Part of the story of Hannibal's greatness is Hannibal's ability to do almost supernatural things. And in the 3rd century BC, people didn't cross those high mountains with armies and with elephants. You didn't do that. The only people in legend who did, the only person who did was Hercules, and Hercules was a divinity. And so there's this idea that these high mountains are places of great remote and sort of supernatural beings. And so in order to survive the crossing for the people on either side, in order to get down with this amazing army that he had to have had the backing of the gods. He had to have been favored from the gods. And this is really important, of course, for Hannibal and for his own army to believe in him, that they were on a cause, maybe that they were going to survive. And so in that way, it's just one of the most important things about Hannibal. And of course, it's the thing that everybody remembers the most about him, is that he crossed the Alps with elephants. And of course, the elephants being the other idea that he brought these amazing creatures of war with him to Italy.
It took Hannibal roughly 2 weeks to cross the Alps with his army. The feat's legacy has endured for more than 2 millennia. Within 6 months, Hannibal had marched his army out from southern Spain. He had quashed unrest north of the river Ebro, overcome the Pyrenees, crossed the mighty Rhone River, and traversed the Alps in one of antiquity's greatest adventures. It was only the beginning.
The danger is that we obsess with this and we forget why Hannibal was doing it. He is doing this great epic, not for the sake of it, not to show off, not to do wonderful things, not to overcome nature, but to begin his main war against Rome. And the whole point is to get to Italy, to fight the Romans on their home soil. So he's done great things, and it is incredible, it is dramatic, but this isn't actually the big story. The big story is what happens next, and what will happen in the years to come, and whether all of what's gone on is actually worthwhile. Because it was only about getting him to the point where he can go to Rome and humiliate them on their home turf.
Battle was close at hand. The real war was about to begin.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.